Hi, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Enjoy listening. My uncle was about to force my 11-year-old cousin into marriage, so I stood up and spoke out. 2 years later, half my family is in jail and the other half wants me to pretend nothing happened. I taught my cousins a language that would change our lives forever. You see, my family had a rule about women and silence. A woman's voice was considered poison after her 16th birthday. The silent ceremony took place at midnight. Your father would hold you down while your mother sewed a red thread through your lips. Not literally, but you wore the thread on your wrist as a reminder. Break the rule once and you would be locked in the laundry room without food. Break it twice and you would have a tooth pulled. No one broke it 3 times. The silence of women was like currency. Whichever man had the quietest home was the most respected in society. At family gatherings, my uncles competed like children, showing off their baseball cards. Mira hadn't made a sound since January. Uncle Dev would brag, spreading his fingers. Uncle Raj would lean back, grinning. That was nothing. Priya was turning 2. When the doctor asked her a question at her checkup, she simply pointed at me for the answer. It actually sounds crazy out loud, but for so long, that was how it had been. And I was the loudest person I knew. I couldn't even finish a conversation without laughing at something the other person said, even if it wasn't funny. I loved singing songs out loud and making weird noises with my friends. So I knew that if I didn't find an answer soon, my life would be over. But I wanted the problem to go away. And then one day it did. I was sitting in 7th grade when Mr. Brown told us we needed to learn a foreign language. My ears perked up, because American Sign Language, ASL, counted. You see, my family and I had been in the US all this time, because it wasn't until you turned 16 and took a vow of silence that you were sent back to your home country. And there, you were forced to settle down and have kids. So 3 times a week, I sat in Ms. Brown's class, learning to talk with my hands. Adrenaline was pumping through my veins. If she'd even written to my parents about my choice of language, they'd have found out what I was up to, and my life would have been over. I didn't even know what I would do with my homework because no one around me spoke the language. But then came Diwali dinner. All our relatives had flown in from back home to eat at our house. It was supposed to be the happiest time of the year. But as we ate, I noticed Priya sitting alone at the end of the table. Tears were silently streaming down her face and she couldn't tell anyone why. She was 17, the year of her silence. When no one was looking, I handed her a glass of water with a note in my hand. Meet me at the garden shed. Bring your sister. I told everyone that I had noticed her sari was wrinkled and I was going to teach her how to fold it properly in the shed. And that's how it all began. At every family gathering, while the men watched cricket and the silent women served food, the younger girls and I would huddle together, all desperate to escape our fate. First I taught them letters, then words. Then we would have entire conversations flowing between our fingers. We were inventive in choosing places to practice, communicating with signs while washing dishes, our hands hidden in soapy water. We developed our own secret gesture. A flick of the wrist meant, he's coming. A gentle tap of the thumb meant, we'll save this conversation for later. By the time I was 15, we had a network. 12 girls, aged between 9 and 15, all fluent in a language our fathers and brothers could not understand. The older women noticed but said nothing. The others began to learn by watching us. It all came crashing down at my cousin Angela's wedding. She was 15, marrying a 65-year-old man who had specifically chosen her for her early, well-practiced silence. We were halfway through the ceremony when I noticed her 11-year-old sister staring at me. When I looked at her hands, she had written, he beats her. She showed me the bruises. I saw Angelica standing there in her red wedding sari, unable to object to her own marriage. Something snapped inside me. As he began to recite his final vows, I stood up and spoke. But this time it wasn't sign language. It was out loud. She didn't want this marriage. He was hurting her. My mother's face went ghostly white. There were gasps around me. The room exploded. 200 guests watched as I broke a cardinal rule. My father grabbed my arm, hissing about shame and consequences. But he froze in place as 6 other girls stood up, some speaking for the first time in years. "We know about the beating," one said. "It's fucking illegal." Another screamed. That's when I heard sirens outside. Through the window, I saw 2 police cars and a Child Protective Services van. Someone had called them about the wedding that was going on. I never found out who. The police came in and started asking questions. They separated Angelique from the others, taking her to a quiet corner. The groom tried to slip out the back door, but an officer stopped him. My father continued to squeeze my hand tighter, leaving marks that would later become bruises. The other men were yelling at their daughters, who spoke up, their faces red with rage. The child protection workers took Angelica into another room. I watched through the doorway as they examined her hands. She was crying and nodding, finally able to tell her truth. One of the workers took pictures of the bruises. The police began writing down names and asking for identification. Their presence made the air electric. My Uncle Dev pushed through the crowd and grabbed his daughter by the hair. She screamed, and a police officer immediately intervened, separating them. This made things worse. They were watching us all even more closely now. The men couldn't discipline their daughters with the authorities present, and their frustration was palpable. The senior officer announced that they were calling off the wedding. He said something about investigating reports of abuse and underage marriage. The groom, seeing that the police were now occupied with the growing chaos of arguing families and officers trying to maintain order, fled during the commotion. This time, no one tried to stop him. My father dragged me toward the car, his grip unwavering. He said nothing, but I could feel his anger radiating off him in waves. My mother followed, clutching her rosary beads so tightly her knuckles were white. She hadn't looked at me once since I spoke. Other families were leaving, too, dragging their daughters across the parking lot. The chaos of slamming doors and roaring engines. In the car, my father's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. He said I had ruined our family's reputation, that we could never show our faces again. He said other men would never respect him again. My mother just kept praying under her breath. The Sanskrit words were barely audible. I stared out the window and tried not to cry as I watched the city lights blur past. At home, he directed me straight to my room. He took my phone and laptop, shoving them into his pockets. He said I would stay there until he decided what to do with me. The door locked from the outside with a click that sounded final. I could hear him raging downstairs and starting to ring, his voice coming through the floorboards. Through the air vent, I could hear him talking to my uncles. He warned them that the police were asking questions. He told them to keep their daughters away from school for a few days until things calmed down. He mentioned something about an urgent family meeting at my grandfather's house. I tried to sleep, but I kept thinking about Angelique. I wondered where they had taken her, if she was safe now. I hoped she was safe. I thought about the other girls who had spoken up. Their fathers were probably doing the same as mine, locking them away like dangerous secrets. Around midnight, I heard a soft knock. My Aunt Mira slipped in with a plate of food, rice, and dal, still warm. She was one of the silent women, but she touched my face gently. She pointed to the food, then to her heart. I knew she was proud of me, even if she could never say it. She pulled out her phone and showed me the messages. My cousins were messaging each other in a group chat I didn't know existed. They were thanking me for speaking out, but they were scared, too. Some of them were already locked in their rooms, too. Their fathers were furious, threatening to send them back early. My aunt left as quietly as she'd come. I ate and tried to think clearly. I knew this was just the beginning. The men would regroup and come up with a plan. They always did when their power was challenged. They would find a way to regain control. The next morning, my father opened my door at dawn. He told me to put on my best sari, blue with gold embroidery. We were going to my grandfather's house. All the men would be there for a council. I knew it was bad. My grandfather was the one who started the tradition of silence in our family 3 generations ago. The drive took 2 hours, through winding country roads. My father was silent the entire way. My mother came, too, but she sat in the back, still clutching those rosary beads. I watched the city turn to countryside, the buildings giving way to fields and forests. My grandfather lived in a big house away from everyone, isolated and imposing. When we arrived, I counted 20 cars in the driveway. All my uncles were there. Some cousins I hadn't seen in years had driven all night to be there. Just the men, really. They gathered in the main room, sitting in a circle on cushions. My grandfather sat in his chair like a king holding court. They made me stand in the center of the circle. My grandfather asked me to explain myself. I told him about Angeli's bruises, keeping my voice calm. I said that the marriage was wrong, that she was only a child. He laughed and said that I was too young to understand our customs, that I had been corrupted by American ideas. The interrogation went on for hours. They asked who had taught me to be so disrespectful. They wanted the names of every girl who knew sign language. I kept saying that I had spoken only about Angeli, nothing else. My uncle Raj stood up and said that I was lying, that I had poisoned the minds of all their daughters. His face was flushed with anger, the veins bulging at his temples as he paced back and forth like a cornered animal. The room grew stuffy. My grandfather sat at the head of the long wooden table, his fingers folded in front of him. The other men, my father, my uncles, the various cousins old enough to have a say in family matters, formed a semicircle around me. The overhead light cast harsh shadows on their faces, making them look like strangers rather than family. Then they began bringing in my cousins, one by one. The first was Priya's younger sister, Kavya, only 12. She was shaking like a leaf, her small frame drowned in an oversized salwar kameez. Her usually bright eyes were wide with terror. My grandfather asked her if she knew sign language. She looked at me and then at the floor, her lip trembling. Her father slapped her on the back of the head and told her to answer. The sound echoed around the room. She nodded yes, tears streaming down her face, and I wanted to hug her and tell her it would be okay, but I couldn't move from my chair. They brought in 8 more girls. Some immediately admitted they were learning American Sign Language, their voices barely audible. Others tried to deny it until their fathers threatened them with consequences I didn't want to imagine. Maya, who was 14, held out the longest, insisting she knew nothing until her father grabbed her wrist so hard she screamed. The youngest was Asha, only 9. She didn't even understand why she was being scolded. She just cried all the time for her mother, who was not allowed into the room, her little voice calling for her mother over and over until her father told her to be quiet. My grandfather declared it was an infection that needed to be cut out. His voice carried the weight of absolute authority, the same one that had ruled our family for decades. He said that all the girls who had learned sign language would immediately undergo a silent ceremony. It did not matter that some were still a long way from 16. He said, desperate times call for desperate measures. The other men nodded in agreement, some enthusiastically, others with what looked like hesitation. They did not dare object. They led us into different rooms. I was taken to the basement, a cold concrete room with one small window near the ceiling that let in just enough light to remind me that the outside world still existed. The walls were unpainted cinder blocks that seemed to absorb any heat. There was a thin mattress on the floor that smelled of mold and a bucket in the corner that I didn't want to think about. My grandfather said I would stay there until I learned some respect. The door was thick wood with a heavy lock that clicked shut with finality when he left. The first night was the worst. The concrete floor radiated cold through the thin mattress. I could hear the house settling above me, creaking and groaning as if it was processing what had happened. Every sound made me jump, footsteps, muffled voices, doors opening and closing. I wrapped myself in the one rough blanket they had left and tried not to think about spiders or mice or how long they planned to keep me there. They kept me there for 3 days. Twice a day, someone brought rice and water. The rice was always cold, sometimes with a few bits of wood chips in it, served on a steel plate that clanked on the concrete when they set it down. No one spoke to me. I heard footsteps upstairs, muffled voices that could have been arguing or could have been normal conversation. It was impossible to tell through the floorboards. Sometimes I heard crying, which could have been my younger cousins. The sound made my chest tighten with guilt and anger. I did push-ups and jumping jacks to keep warm and sane. I counted them obsessively, 20 push-ups, 50 jumping jacks, then started over. I recited poems I'd memorized for school, sang songs under my breath, practiced American Sign Language signs against the wall where no one could see. I marked the passage of time by the small rectangle of sunlight that moved across the floor from the window. When it disappeared each evening, the darkness seemed total. On the fourth morning, I heard a car pull up. The sound of the engine was different from the family cars I recognized. Then voices I didn't recognize. A woman asking for my name, her tone professional and urgent. My grandfather's voice, sweet as honey, telling me I had the flu and was resting. The woman insisted on seeing me. She said she was my guidance counselor from school. Ms. Brown had come looking for me. My heart pounded, hoping and fearing at the same time. I heard an argument. My grandfather's voice rose slightly, losing some of its controlled smoothness. Ms. Brown's voice remained calm, using words like duty reporter and welfare check. Then footsteps descended into the basement, fast and angry. My grandfather unlocked the door and hissed at me to clean myself up. The sudden light from the stairs made me squint. He tossed me some clean clothes and told me to change quickly. He said that if I tried anything, my cousins would pay the price. His eyes were cold as winter stones. I changed my clothes with shaking hands, trying to smooth my tangled hair with my fingers. The clean clothes felt strange after days of wearing the same outfit. My grandfather was waiting outside the door, tapping his foot impatiently. As I stepped outside, he grabbed my hand hard enough to leave marks and led me up the stairs. I was lifted up. Miss Brown stood in the living room, arms crossed, her usually warm face tense. She looked me up and down, noticing my disheveled hair and pale skin, the dark circles under my eyes. She asked if I was okay. I nodded and said I had been ill but was feeling better, the lie leaving a bitter taste on my tongue. My grandfather stood right behind me, his hand heavy on my shoulder, his fingers digging in just enough to remind me of his presence. Ms. Brown asked why I hadn't answered my phone. My grandfather said smoothly that I had been resting without electronics, on doctor's orders because of a severe migraine. She didn't look convinced. Her eyes narrowed a little as she studied us both. She asked to speak to me alone. My grandfather said it wasn't appropriate in our culture, that unmarried girls didn't meet alone with strangers. She looked at him for a long moment, and I could see her processing this information, putting it aside. Then she looked right at me. She asked if I remembered what we had learned in American Sign Language last week. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. I knew this was my chance. When my grandfather wasn't looking, I signed the word help as clearly as I could, my fingers moving in the familiar pattern we'd practiced. Her expression didn't change, but I saw her notice. Saw the slight widening of her eyes before she composed herself. She said she hoped I'd be back in class soon, and then she was gone. The moment her car disappeared down the driveway, my grandfather slapped me. The force of the blow twisted my head to the side, and I tasted blood where my teeth had cut my cheek. He saw my reflection in the window. He called me a stupid girl, and said I'd only made things worse for everyone. He threw me back into the basement, pushing me so hard that I tripped on the stairs. I could hear him making more phone calls, his voice urgent and angry. I couldn't sleep that night. My face throbbed where he'd hit me, and I kept replaying Ms. Brown's visit. Did she understand? Would she come back? Or had I just made things worse, as my grandfather had said? I pressed my back against the cold wall and tried not to cry. The next day, Ms. Brown returned. This time, she brought a social worker named Janet, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a businesslike manner. They said they were doing a welfare check, that it was standard procedure when a student misses a few days. My grandfather was forced to let them in, though his smile was strained. He quickly called some aunties to make the house look normal. Within minutes, they were cooking and cleaning as if it were a normal day, filling the air with the smell of spices and the sounds of everyday life. They tidied me up again. My aunt combed my hair roughly and squeezed my cheeks to give it color. They dressed me in a bright blue salwar kameez and primed me for what I would have to say. My aunt whispered that if I didn't cooperate, they had already found husbands for us all. She showed me the photos on her phone, men in their 30s and 40s, some already married, all from traditional families back home. They would send us back within a week. I sat in the living room, trying to look normal, while fear and rage raged inside me. The social worker asked me questions about school and home. I gave memorized answers while my grandfather watched from his chair, his presence a weight in the room. But I had hidden my American Sign Language notebook in my lap, under my pillow. As I shifted to answer a question about my favorite subjects, I let it fall. The pages scattered across the floor, revealing months of sign language practice, notes on how I was teaching my cousins, drawings of hands forming words. Janet bent to pick it up and saw pages covered in sign language practice. She slowly picked up each page, taking her time studying them. She handed it back to me with a small nod that my grandfather didn't see. She took pictures of the house, saying it was standard procedure, her camera clicking away. She took pictures of the locks on the doors, the bars on the windows, which my grandfather said were for security. She mentioned that they would be back for future visits. My grandfather's jaw clenched, but he smiled and said that they were always welcome, that they had nothing to hide. After they left, things moved quickly. My grandfather called an emergency family meeting. He said the ceremony would take place that night, that there was no time to wait. He called for all families to come immediately. He said that the outside world was trying to destroy our traditions, and we had to act quickly. The men began preparing the main room, moving furniture, arranging ceremonial objects with a distinct lack of practice. They led us girls out of our various hiding places. We looked unkempt, unwashed hair, wrinkled clothes, empty eyes that had seen too much. Some of the girls had bruises they tried to hide. They made us bathe and dress in white saris, white for purity, they said. White as ghosts, white as surrender. The fabric felt heavy on my skin. They lined us up by age in the preparation room. I was the eldest, so I had to go first. I looked at the others. Kavya was still shaking. Maya was defiant but afraid. Little Asha was confused and looking for her mother. The room filled with relatives as the sun set, casting long shadows through the windows. The men sat in an inner circle on cushions, their faces grave with the weight of tradition. The women were silent, standing against the walls like sentries, their red threads visible on their wrists, their eyes downcast. On a low table sat silver plates with red thread and scissors. Ceremonial objects glittered in the lamplight. The tools of a tradition that had stolen voices for generations. My stomach twisted at the sight of them. My grandfather began to chant in Sanskrit, his voice deep and rhythmic. The other men joined in, their voices creating a hypnotic rhythm that seemed to vibrate the air. They lit incense, which made the air thick and hard to breathe. Sandalwood and something else that made me dizzy. Smoke rose toward the ceiling like clinging fingers. My father came up with the red thread. His hand shook slightly, but his face was stony. He did not meet my gaze. I looked at my cousins. Some were crying quietly, tears streaming down their cheeks. Others were staring straight ahead, already practicing their silence. The youngest was sucking her thumb, a habit she had given up years ago. I thought of Angela, wherever she was. I thought of all the women standing against the walls, decades of silence pressed between them like flowers in a book. I thought of Miss Brown and Janet. Somewhere out there, in a world where women's voices mattered, I had made my decision. As my father extended his hand toward me, I motioned to the other girls. We practiced it in whispers and gestures when the adults weren't looking. We scattered in different directions. The men didn't expect it. We had planned our escape routes, memorized which windows opened, which doors led where. Some of the girls ran for the doors, others headed for the windows. The room erupted in chaos. White saris flashed like birds taking flight. I ran to the kitchen, where I knew the back door was. My Uncle Dev caught my cousin near the stairs, his hand tightening on her dupatta. She twisted away, leaving the shawl in his hands. The two girls ran outside before they were caught in the courtyard. I heard screams and cries all around. My sari got tangled under my feet, slowing me down. I pulled it up, no longer caring about propriety. I stormed into the kitchen. The women were there, preparing food, as they always did during ceremonies. Pots were bubbling on the stove, and the familiar smell of dal and rice filled the air. They looked at me in shock. I begged them to help us. The words tumbled out of my mouth. Most looked away, trained by years of fear. Their hands continued their work automatically. But my Aunt Mira stepped forward. She had always been different. Quiet in her rebellion. She blocked the doorway as my father appeared, breathing hard from the chase. He ordered her to leave. She shook her head, a simple gesture that seemed to shake the foundations of our world. Another aunt joined her, then another. Slowly, the women who had remained silent formed a wall between us and the men. For the first time in decades, they were choosing sides. My father tried to squeeze past, but their hands were locked, their red threads like a chain tying them together. At that moment, my grandmother appeared. She no longer came to the ceremonies, staying in her room with her memories and photographs of her life before the silence. But she stood there now, 90 years old and furious. Her white hair was loose around her shoulders, not tied in the usual knot. She still wore the red thread from when she was silenced at 16. The fabric had faded over the decades, but it had never broken. She raised her hand and ripped it from her wrist with arthritic, gnarled fingers. She spoke for the first time in 40 years. Her voice was hoarse but clear, like a door opening on rusty hinges. She told her sons to stop. She said she had seen this tradition ruin too many lives. Seen too many bright girls fade. She said she had been silent when they had silenced her daughters, but she would not watch it happen to her granddaughters. Her words filled the room like water breaking through a dam. The room became completely silent. Even the pots on the stove seemed to have died down in their boiling. My grandfather looked at his mother as if she were a stranger. She walked through the crowd of men, who parted for her as if she were parting the sea. Her steps were slow but sure. She took the scissors from the ceremonial plate and cut each red thread into pieces. The sound of the cutting seemed impossibly loud. Then she turned to the women standing against the walls. She told them they could speak. She said their silence had given men too much power for too long. She said she had spent 40 years regretting her silence. 40 years of words rotting in her throat. One by one, the women began to remove their strings. Some cried as they did so. Decades of suppressed emotion poured out. Others laughed, the sound rusty and beautiful. My mother removed hers and said my name for the first time in years. The sound made me cry. The men didn't know what to do. There were fewer of them. And more importantly, the moral authority they had arrogated to themselves was crumbling. Some of the uncles tried to grab their wives, but the women stood together. My aunt told her husband she would leave and take her daughters if he tried to continue. She had already packed, she said. She had been planning this for years. Other women had made similar threats. The revolution we had started with sign language had become something more. My grandfather ordered everyone to stop. His voice had lost its power, sounding almost plaintive. He said that traditions existed for a reason, that they kept our culture strong. But his own mother had laughed in his face, a sound like ringing bells. She had asked him what the excuse was for stealing women's voices. She had asked him if he had ever wondered what his wife would say all these years ago if she could speak. She had asked him if he knew his daughters' favorite colors, their dreams, their fears. His silence was answer enough. The ceremony had fallen like a house of cards. Families began to quarrel, years of resentment spilling out. Some men tried to maintain control, but their wives stopped listening. My father looked lost as my mother told him what she thought about his weakness. She said he was hiding behind tradition instead of thinking for himself. She said she had loved him once, but she didn't know if she loved him now. She would have to relearn who she was by having a voice. Over the next few weeks, everything changed. The family that had seemed so strong, so eternal, showed its cracks. Some families fell apart entirely. Stalwart traditionalists cut ties with those who had abandoned the rules of silence. My cousins were thrown back and forth between relatives while my parents figured out where they belonged. The girls' network remained strong, constantly sharing messages, resources, and support. We created a secret Facebook group where we could communicate freely. Ms. Brown helped several girls report abuse to authorities. She connected us with counselors and lawyers who understood the cultural context but did not accept culture as an excuse for abuse. Some cases moved forward, others did not. But the threats were enough to make some men reconsider their actions. The community could no longer hide. The local press picked up the story. Reporters called, asking for interviews. My parents barely spoke to me at first. There was something different about the house, as if the walls were learning to accommodate new sounds. Then my mother started making my favorite dishes. Aloo paratha with extra butter. Mango kulfi, which she used to make when I was little. She would ask about school in her amused voice, stumbling over her words. She would tell me stories about her own childhood before the silence, how she wanted to be a teacher, how she loved to sing. My father took more time, but eventually asked me to show him what I had learned in sign language. His fingers were clumsy when I taught him signs. I feel sorry. Some cousins went to live with relatives who had already given up the old ways. Others stayed with parents who were slow to change. Some were sent back to their home countries, but they now had phones and stayed in touch. We continued to teach each other sign language, just in case, but also because it had become our language of rebellion, our secret freedom. My grandmother became our unexpected protector. She would visit families and tell them of her decades of enforced silence. She would tell the men how much they had missed by not hearing their wives' thoughts. She would tell them of the poems she had composed in her head, the jokes she wanted to share, the advice she wanted to give. She told the women that they were stronger than they thought. Some listened, some did not, but she kept talking, making up for 40 years of silence. The next family gathering felt different. It was Diwali, usually our biggest celebration. Half the usual crowd was gone, but those who showed up brought their voices. The women talked and laughed, their words mixing with the fireworks outside. Some still wore their strings by choice, but it was a choice now. The men seemed smaller, somehow. No longer the only ones allowed to speak. They had to give way to other voices. Angeli was there with her sister. She lived with progressive cousins and went to school. She still had nightmares, but she was recovering. She cut her hair short in defiance of tradition and wore jeans instead of traditional clothes. She thanked me for standing up for her. I told her that we had all done this together. Without the other girls standing up, too, nothing would have changed. We were each other's voices when we had no voices of our own. We still taught sign language, but now it was just another way to communicate. Some mothers learned it to talk to daughters who were still searching for their voices after years of silence. We created signs for feelings that had been buried for too long. Signs for the special frustrations of unspoken words, for the joys of earthly speech, for the fears that still lingered. The language that had begun as rebellion became healing. My father apologized months later. We were sitting in the garden where he had taught me to ride a bike, where we had planted tomatoes together when I was 7. He said he had followed tradition without thinking, because that was what his father had done. He said that watching my mother find her voice again had given him an understanding of what he had been missing. He said he was proud of me for being braver than he had ever been. He still struggled with change, but he was trying. Not everyone had changed. Some families had grown stronger, moving into communities that still practiced old ways. They called us corrupt, said we had lost our culture. Some girls were lost to us, quickly married off before they could rebel. We couldn't save everyone. The weight of that failure lay heavy on my shoulders. But we had cracked the foundation of silence that had stood for generations. And through those cracks, voices were finally being released. The months after Diwali were strange. Some families pretended nothing had changed, while others fell apart entirely. My cousin Kavya's father tried to arrange a marriage for her, even though she was only 13. He found some guy from back home who was 35 and owned a store. He thought that if he moved quickly, he could marry her off before anyone could stop him. But Kavya learned more than just sign language from us. She recorded her father talking about the marriage plans on her phone. She sent the recording to our group chat, and we knew we had to act fast. I called Mrs. Brown, and she contacted the authorities. For 2 days, Kavya lived with my family while her father dealt with a visit from Child Protective Services. My house became like a temporary shelter for cousins fleeing bad situations. My parents weren't thrilled about it at first, but my mom always said she wished she'd had someone to help her at that age. At one point, we had 3 girls living with us. My dad converted the basement from a storage room into a bedroom. The same basement I was locked in at my grandpa's house. It had bright colors and windows and no locks on the doors. Uncle Dev showed up at our door one night demanding his daughter back. He was drunk and angry, banging on the door so hard the windows shook. My dad stood up to him for the first time in his life. He told Dev to leave or he'd call the police. They got into a fight on the front lawn. The neighbors came out to watch. Someone actually called the police and Dev spent the night in jail. Things got worse after that. The traditional family began to organize. They were holding meetings at my grandfather's house to figure out how to regain control. Someone had leaked their plans to us. They were going to pull all the girls out of the school and send them back immediately. They had already bought plane tickets for some of them. We had to act fast. Ms. Brown helped us get in touch with a lawyer who specialized in custody issues. Some of the girls were able to file for protective orders. Others had to hide out with supportive relatives. It was like a weird underground railroad for teenage girls trying to escape forced marriages. The community was completely divided. At the grocery store, families literally moved to different aisles to avoid each other. The temple had to hold 2 separate services because people refused to worship together. Some of my uncles tried to start their own temple, which still followed the old rules, but they couldn't find enough people to fund it. My grandfather made one last attempt at power. He called a meeting of all the male elders from the surrounding states. They were going to vote to officially banish the families who had abandoned the tradition of silence. He thought that if enough communities banded together, they could pressure everyone to come back into line. But my grandmother had other plans. She had been talking to women from other communities for months. She organized a meeting in response that same day. Women who had been silenced for decades came from hundreds of miles away. They filled the community center we rented. Their red strings were left behind. There were maybe 30 at the men's meeting. There were more than 200 at the women's meeting. My grandmother told her story again, but this time she named names. She told of an elder who had hit his wife or chanted while cooking. She told of a girl who had identified herself rather than been silenced. She had dates and details that made the men's claims about the tradition sound like what they really were: control and abuse. Some women from other communities returned home and took out their strings that same day. Their husbands called my grandfather in rage, saying his family had infected them with rebellion. The support network had grown beyond our family. We started getting messages from girls in other states asking how to learn sign language, how to fight back. My father lost his job because his boss was one of the traditional uncles. But my mother got her first job in 20 years. She worked at a preschool, finally teaching like she always wanted. Her voice grew stronger every day. She now sang while cooking, badly but happily. The next crisis came when Uncle Raj tried to kidnap his daughter from school. He showed up with 2 other men and tried to force her into a van, but the school was ready. We warned them about the possible attempts. They immediately locked the school down and called the police. He was arrested in the parking lot while his daughter watched from the classroom window. That's when things got really ugly. Traditional families started threatening anyone who helped us. Our tires were slashed. Someone threw a brick through our window. My dad installed security cameras and my mom learned how to use pepper spray. We traveled in groups and were constantly being checked. But we didn't back down. Girls who had been forced into marriage started reaching out for help. Some were able to get divorces or annulments. Others were stuck, but at least they could talk to us. They could know they weren't alone. We raised money to help some of them start over. My cousin Maya became our spokesperson. She was 16 and fierce. She started a YouTube channel talking about our experiences. The videos went viral in our community and beyond. She received death threats, but also messages from girls all over the world who had encountered similar traditions. The turning point came on my cousin Nia's 16th birthday. Her parents were traditional but hesitant. They had planned a small ceremony, not a complete silence, but a symbolic threading. Nia played the part until the moment. Then she stood up and gave the speech she had been rehearsing for weeks. She talked about wanting to be a doctor, about having dreams that needed a voice. She talked about loving her parents, but not their traditions. She took off the thread they had just tied and put it back. Her mother began to cry, then took off her own thread. Her father stood there in shock as his wife said his name for the first time in 20 years. It became a pattern. Girls would pretend to agree until the big moment, then refuse. Some families accepted it, others exploded. But each refusal made the next one easier. The tradition died one birthday at a time. My grandfather's health began to fail. I think the loss of control broke him. He had a heart attack and spent weeks in the hospital. My grandmother sat by his bedside and talked to him constantly, making up for all the years of silence. I don't know if he heard her, but she needed to talk. When he came out, he was different, smaller, somehow. He stopped calling meetings, stopped trying to control everyone. He spent his days sitting in his garden, watching the world change without him. Sometimes I felt sorry for him, but then I remembered the basement and the fear in my cousin's eyes. The next Diwali, we held 2 celebrations. One for traditional families, one for everyone else. Ours was louder, full of women's voices and laughter. We could hear the other celebration from across town, quiet and subdued. Some families sent members to both, trying to keep their feet on the ground in both worlds. Angeli went to college. She studied law, wanting to help other girls in our situation. She still had scars, physical and emotional, but she was building a life. Her younger sister lived with her, safe from the marriage their father had planned. My parents renewed their vows on our wedding anniversary. This time, my mother made her own promises instead of staying silent. She promised to never stay silent again, to teach her daughters to use their voices. My father promised to listen, to value her words. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. The sign language classes continued, but now they were just for fun and communication. We taught parents and siblings, creating a truly inclusive language. Some of the older women struggled with arthritis, signing, but they persisted. They had waited too long to communicate freely. Ms. Brown received an award from the state for her work. She brought all of us girls to the ceremony. We signed thank you in unison. A sea of hands moving together. She cried and said we taught her more than she taught us. Some families left, unable to accept the change. They found ways, places, to have their daughters' voices stolen at 16. We couldn't save these girls, but we could be prepared if they ever asked for help. My grandmother died that spring. At her funeral, hundreds of women spoke of how she had inspired them. They shared stories of their first words after the silence, of the courage she had given them. Even some men spoke up, admitting they had been wrong. My grandfather sat in the front row, looking lost without her voice to fill his days. By the time I graduated from high school, the tradition of silence had mostly disappeared in our community. Some families held symbolic ceremonies with temporary strings that lasted a day or a week. Others abandoned it entirely. A few clung to the old ways, but they became increasingly isolated. I went to college on a scholarship, planning to study social work. I wanted to help other girls trapped in traditions that hurt them. My parents were proud, though my father still sometimes looked surprised when I voiced my opinions over dinner. The network we had created became a formal organization. We received nonprofit status and funding to help girls escape forced marriages and abuse. We held workshops on sign language and self-defense. Some of the women who had remained silent the longest became our fiercest advocates. At my last family reunion before college, I counted the voices, not the silences. 23 women talked, laughed, argued, sang. My younger cousin danced to a song she wrote. My aunts discussed politics while cooking. My mother told embarrassing stories about my childhood. The men had mostly adapted. They helped with the cooking and cleaning that had once been beneath them. They listened when their wives and daughters spoke. Some still looked awkward, but they tried. The change was slow, but it was happening. I still use signs sometimes when words aren't enough. The language that saved us has become part of us. We teach it to each new girl in the family, just in case. But it's a choice now, not a desperate need. Our voices are free, and we will never let them be silenced again. The last time I looked at my red string bracelet before leaving for college, I cut it off and threw it away. I didn't need that reminder anymore. None of us did. We had found our voices, and nothing could take them away.